Alright, so this week we talked about depression in relation specifically to children and adolescents. Um, and the first question for our assignment is, what are the common signs and symptoms in children and adolescents experiencing depression? So, after reading our articles, I found that the National Institute of Mental Health says that about 11% of adolescents have suffered depression by 18 years of age. Um, which I guess wasn't too shocking to me. I think that depression is fairly common in teenagers, and I actually kind of thought that it would be higher than 11% um, as far as teenagers go. Now, as far as children, especially in reading that it can happen as young as 3 years of age, that caught me off guard. It's kind of hard for me to picture a young child depressed. I think that it's more understandable for, I guess, a teenager than it is for, in my mind, for like a toddler or a young child. Um, the article also stated that females are more likely than males to be depressed. I don't know if that's just because of the criticism females often put on themselves, especially as adolescents, trying to live up to things like a standard of beauty, and there's just a lot more involved in a little girl's mind than a boy's. Not to say that males don't go through those same changes. I just wasn't surprised by that fact. And then it said children may pretend to be sick, as far as like signs and symptoms go and recognizing it. Children could pretend to be sick, refuse to go to school, um, cling to a parent out of worry that they may leave or something may happen. Kids will sulk, get into trouble, be negative, grouchy, feel misunderstood, cheerful, irritable, lose a lot of sleep, or have decreased energy. And when I first read all of those things, I thought, well, isn't part of that just being a child or a teen? I mean, or just going through a phase. There are a lot of people, I think you can be grouchy and irritable and lose sleep and not be clinically depressed. I guess, though, those are some signs we can look for, but they don't necessarily mean that someone is clinically depressed. So I think it is difficult to tell if a child is suffering depression versus going through some sort of phase or just having a really terrible couple weeks due to other things. So it's definitely important to um, ask the child's pediatrician or psychologist or psychiatrist before just assuming that a child is clinically depressed. The second question was explain the pathophysiological mechanisms that contribute to these assessment findings. In our article, we read that depressive disorder is about 30 to 40% genetic, 60 to 70% environmental. Um, and as far as the environmental, it listed stressors such as sexual abuse, trauma, low social support, divorce rates, and parents um, are like some of the huge factors for depression that's caused by, I guess, environmental factors. And that is definitely what I would think. I think that definitely depression can be clinical and genetic for sure, but majority of the time, um, it seems to be related to something such as abuse and trauma. I did study psychology as my first degree, and I read a whole lot about abuse and trauma leading to adolescent depression, and there just seemed to be a giant correlation between those things. Um, Genetically, although they do say 30 to 40% is some sort of like genetical clinical depression, there's not a specific gene that's reliable as far as what I read in the articles that they found that predicts depression. They just see that there is a trend. Um, as far as chemically, some of the causes are deficiencies in monoamines, dysfunction of specific brain regions, altered HPA axis activity, reduced GABA, and dysregulation of glutamine systems, um, and impaired, I don't even know how to say that word, circadian rhythms. I had to look that up. So those are some of the more like chemical reasons that people are depressed, which makes sense. A lot of times you hear about the lack of serotonin in someone's brain leading to chemical depression. Explain the pharmacological actions of the drugs commonly used to manage depression in children and adolescents. typically antidepressants work by blocking reuptake inhibitors, um, or the breakdown of monoamines. We hear a lot of SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. They seem to work really well, or norepinephrine, depending on what it is that is causing um, which thing is causing the depression in the brain. Where's their lack of? The most common one is definitely an SSRI, and the unknown fact about SSRIs is they actually take several weeks to work. So when someone actually starts on SSRI, they need to know that this is going to take a few weeks and it's not an instant thing in the brain. It takes the brain a while to adjust and to um, figure out how to block reuptake of serotonin. NMDA receptor antagonists are another type of drug that's used. They produce a rapid antidepressant action for more severe depression and those who are typically resistant to other antidepressants or who have been on SSRIs for so long that they're just not working anymore. It's a lot stronger of a drug. They involved increased glutamine transmission and induction of synaptogenesis. So there are other drugs out there besides um, SSRIs and monoamines and norepinephrine drugs, but they just are a lot more rare and only used in more severe forms of depression. I think that's all the questions, but with that, I just want to say that I also strongly believe that for depression, counseling is really helpful. I don't think it's the end-all be-all, and I do believe in medicine and drugs to be effective, but I've seen a lot of children and adolescents, well, older children. Like I said, I haven't really seen young children diagnosed as clinical depressed, which I find interesting if a doctor's willing to diagnose a 3-year-old with depression, and not diagnose them with something like ADHD. But with that said, I do believe that counseling is really important. I think that's really beneficial for kids to be able to sit down and talk about things and have someone be encouraging and support them. And I just really believe that whole process is super beneficial, especially for a child or adolescent when it comes to depression. Not ruling out drugs by any means. I just think that there's another component besides just taking drugs. I think that visiting a psychologist is also super beneficial. And I think that is the end of the discussion.